The dust of a life left behind coated Jedediah Stone's throat and clung to the worn fabric of his city coat. For 3 days, the stagecoach had rattled his bones and filled his world with the monotonous, creaking rhythm of its journey west. He had left St. Louis with little more than a folded-up deed, a heart full of bruised hope, and the echoing shame of a business that had crumbled into ash and debt. The West, he'd been told, was a place a man could start over, a vast, empty canvas where the past was just a whisper on the wind. The town of Redemption, Montana, didn't look like much of a canvas. It was a single dusty street flanked by a dozen or so wooden buildings, all of them looking tired and sun-bleached, as if they were slowly surrendering to the vast, indifferent landscape that surrounded them. The mountains in the distance, however, were another story. They clawed at the impossibly blue sky, their peaks still stubbornly clinging to patches of snow, even in the heat of late summer. They promised permanence, a silent, majestic strength that Jedediah craved with an almost physical ache. He stepped down from the coach, his legs stiff and unreliable. The deed in his pocket felt thin and foolish now. He'd bought the land site unseen from a fast-talking salesman in a smoky St. Louis tavern. $100, nearly every cent he had left to his name, for 160 acres and a homestead. The salesman had called it a forgotten jewel. The locals in the last town had called the seller a swindler and the land the old Miller place, a name they'd spoken with a pitying shake of their heads. Forgotten is right, Jedediah muttered to himself, pulling his hat down to shield his eyes from the glare. He found the sheriff's office easily enough. It was a squat, solid-looking building with a single barred window. The man behind the desk was built along the same lines, squat and solid, with a thick, graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, even a city man with a fool's deed in his hand. "Sheriff Brody," Jedediah introduced himself, offering a hand. The sheriff took it in a grip like a blacksmith's vise. "What can I do for you, Mr. Stone?" "Jedediah Stone. I've bought a property nearby, the old Miller place." Brody's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered with a familiar mix of sympathy and weariness. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "You don't say. Paid a fair price, I hope." Jedediah felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. $100. The sheriff let out a low whistle. "He saw you coming, son. Old man Miller died near on 2 years ago. His wife followed him that winter. The place has been sitting empty ever since. Went to a nephew back east who just wanted it off his books. Guess he found his man." "It's that bad?" Jedediah's heart sank. "It ain't good," Brody said, with a bluntness that was somehow kinder than false hope. "The house is likely falling in on itself. The barn's probably a sieve. And the well, Miller was always complaining about the well. And you've got a neighbor you'll want to watch. Silas Blackwood. Owns the spread to the north. He's been trying to get his hands on the Miller land for years, mostly for the water rights from the creek that cuts through it. He's not a man who takes kindly to new competition." The bruised hope in Jedediah's chest shriveled a little more. "I see. Look, son," the sheriff said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm not trying to scare you off, just giving you the lay of the land. Blackwood is all bluster mostly. Just keep to yourself, mind your fences, and you should be fine. The place has potential, I suppose, if you're willing to bleed for it." Jedediah nodded, the word bleed hanging in the air. He'd already bled in St. Louis. Bled money, bled confidence, bled pride. A little more, out here under the open sky, seemed a fair price for a second chance. He bought a sturdy horse, a pack mule, and enough supplies to last him a few weeks from the general store. The proprietor eyeing him with the same pitying curiosity as the sheriff. The directions were simple. Follow the main road out of town until it turned to a dirt track, then follow the creek until he saw a sagging gate. The ride out was both daunting and beautiful. The sheer scale of the land was overwhelming. It wasn't empty, as he'd first thought. It was teeming with life. Hawks circling on thermal updrafts, prairie dogs popping their heads up from burrows, the rustle of unseen things in the tall, dry grass. The air was clean and smelled of sage and sun-baked earth. For the first time in a long time, Jedediah felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was real, not numbers in a ledger or the cloying air of a crowded city, but solid, tangible earth. He found the gate, just as described. It was indeed sagging, one hinge broken, the wood weathered to a silver gray. A faded, hand-carved sign read, "Miller's Rest." It looked more like a final resting place than a place of respite. He pushed the gate open, its groan a lonely sound in the vast quiet, and led his horse and mule onto his land. The track was overgrown, the ruts from the last wagon wheels softened by 2 years of wind and rain. He followed it through a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering secrets to the breeze, and then the homestead came into view. Sheriff Brody had been generous. The house was a small, sad-looking cabin, its porch tilted at a drunken angle, a few shingles missing from the roof like lost teeth. The windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out at the wilderness. The barn beside it was in even worse shape, its great doors hanging askew, a large section of its roof caved in. The whole place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next strong wind to give it an excuse to finally collapse. Jedediah dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft, untrodden earth. A profound sense of foolishness washed over him. He had traded the last of his money for a ruin, a ghost of a ranch. He tied the animals to a fence post that looked sturdy enough and walked slowly toward the house. The front door was stuck fast. He put his shoulder into it, and with a screech of tortured wood, it gave way, opening into a single dusty room. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust. A thick, gray blanket covered everything. A simple table and 2 chairs, a cold and rusty stove, a narrow cot with a rotted mattress. Cobwebs, thick as cotton, draped the corners of the room. It was a scene of utter abandonment, a place where life had simply stopped. He walked through the main room into a smaller, adjoining space that must have been the bedroom. More of the same. An old wardrobe stood against one wall, its door slightly ajar. He pulled it open, half expecting a family of mice to scurry out. Instead, he found a few faded calico dresses, smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. A wave of sadness hit him. This had been someone's home. Someone had loved this place. With a heavy sigh, he turned to leave, his mind already calculating the immense, impossible task ahead of him. He would start with the roof. A man needed a solid roof over his head. The barn could wait. He'd sleep in the main room, under the stars if he had to. As he stepped back out onto the tilted porch, a flicker of movement near the dilapidated barn caught his eye. He froze, his hand instinctively going to the pistol he'd bought, but had no idea how to use properly. He squinted, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. It was a girl. No, a young woman. She was standing half hidden in the shadows of the barn doorway, as still as a deer that had just scented a predator. She was thin, dressed in what looked like a boy's patched trousers and a loose-fitting shirt, both several sizes too big and faded to the color of the dust. Her hair was a wild sun-streaked tangle that fell past her shoulders, and her face, smudged with dirt, was all sharp angles and enormous, wary eyes. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they were fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. She wasn't armed, at least not that he could see, but she held herself with a kind of coiled energy, like a spring wound tight. She looked like a part of the wild landscape, as if she'd sprung from the earth itself. Jedediah slowly lowered his hand from his pistol. He didn't want to frighten her. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. She didn't answer. Her eyes narrowed, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. "I don't mean you any harm," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "My name is Jedediah Stone. I'm the new owner." At the word owner, a flicker of something, anger, fear, betrayal, crossed her face. Her lips, which had been a thin, pale line, pressed together even tighter. "This is my home," she said, her voice low and raspy, as if from disuse. It was a fierce, protective declaration, a challenge thrown down in the dust between them. Jedediah stopped, his mind reeling. The sheriff had said the place was empty. He'd mentioned no one, certainly not a girl living in the ruins. He looked from her defiant face to the crumbling cabin, to the caved-in barn. This was her home? He had bought a ranch for $100, a place to start his life anew, and it seemed he had just met the one homeless soul who already lived there. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. The girl, the woman, didn't move a muscle, her stormy eyes never leaving his. Jedediah felt a complex mix of emotions, surprise, confusion, and a strange, unexpected pang of compassion. She looked so fiercely protective of this wreck of a place, in this forgotten patch of dirt. To him, it was a symbol of his last, desperate gamble. To her, it was clearly everything. "Your home?" he repeated gently, trying to keep the shock from his voice. "Did the Millers... Were you with them?" She gave a short, sharp shake of her head. Her tangled hair flew for a moment, catching the afternoon light. "They let me be. I worked for my keep. When they passed, I stayed." The simple, unadorned facts of her statement hit Jedediah harder than any sob story could have. She was an orphan, a stray, left behind with the rest of the property. He thought of the lavender-scented dresses in the wardrobe, of the quiet sadness that permeated the cabin. This girl was the living embodiment of that sadness. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, her gaze darting from his face to the horse and mule, as if assessing the permanence of his arrival. "Ellie," she finally clipped out. Just Ellie. No last name offered, none expected. "Well, Ellie," Jedediah said, taking off his hat and running a hand through his dusty hair, "it seems we have a situation here." "No situation," she retorted, her chin jutting out again. "This is my place. You're the one who's trespassing." Jedediah couldn't help a small, wry smile. "I'm afraid this deed says otherwise." He patted the pocket of his coat. "Bought and paid for, legal and proper." He saw the fear flash in her eyes again, quickly masked by anger. She was like a cornered animal, all bristle and defensive posturing. He realized he had to tread carefully. He was bigger, stronger, and held a piece of paper that gave him all the power. But looking at her, standing so small and defiant in the face of it all, he felt no sense of victory. "Look," he said, changing his tone, "I'm not here to throw you out. Good heavens, where would you go?" Her silence was the answer. Nowhere. There was nowhere to go. "I just need a place to start over," he explained, hoping a little honesty might bridge the gap between them. "I'm not a rancher. I'm a man who needs to learn to be one. This place, broken as it is all I've got." He watched her process this. Her gaze swept over him, taking in his city coat, his soft hands, his earnest, tired face. He could see the skepticism warring with a sliver of something else. Maybe she recognized a fellow soul clinging to the edge. "The roof leaks," she said suddenly, her voice flat. It wasn't a complaint. It was a test. "I noticed," Jedediah replied. "That's the first thing I aim to fix. The well pump is broken. You have to haul water up by the bucket, and the water's got a sulfur taste this time of year. All right, there's a cougar that dens in the rocks up north. It took one of Miller's calves last year. I'll be careful." She seemed to run out of warnings. She fell silent again, her shoulders slumping just a fraction, the fight going out of her for a moment. She looked impossibly young. "I'm tired, Ellie," Jedediah said, his own exhaustion settling deep in his bones. "And I'm hungry. And I have 160 acres of work ahead of me. I'm not looking for a fight. I'm just looking for a place to land." He walked over to his pack mule and began to unstrap his supplies. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting her watch him. He pulled out a slab of bacon, a bag of coffee beans, and a heavy cast-iron skillet. He didn't look at her, but he was acutely aware of her presence, a silent, watchful shadow at the edge of his new world. He set about building a fire in the stone-ring pit a few yards from the cabin. His hands were clumsy, unaccustomed to the task, but he eventually managed to coax a small flame to life. As the fire grew, casting a warm, dancing light against the encroaching twilight, he risked a glance toward the barn. She was still there, but she had moved from the doorway to lean against a corner post. The aroma of coffee soon filled the air, rich and comforting, followed by the sizzle of bacon in the pan. It was the smell of civilization, of home. He knew she must be hungry. She was painfully thin, with a gauntness that spoke of lean times. He cooked the entire slab of bacon and brewed a full pot of coffee. He ate his share from the pan, then piled the rest onto a tin plate. He poured coffee into his only other cup. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward her. She tensed as he approached, her body going rigid again. He stopped a safe distance away and set the plate and the cup on top of a flat, weathered stump that sat between them. "There's more than enough," he said simply. Then he turned his back on her and walked back to the fire, giving her the privacy to accept or refuse. He sat by the flames, staring into their hypnotic dance, feeling the day's journey and the weight of his new reality press down on him. He had bought a ruin. He had a hostile neighbor, and he had a wild, homeless girl living in his barn. This was not the clean, simple start he had envisioned. He heard a faint sound behind him, the scrape of the tin plate on the stump. He didn't turn around. He just kept watching the fire, giving her space. A few moments later, he heard the soft sound of someone eating, quick and furtive, like a squirrel who'd found a nut. A small, weary smile touched Jedediah's lips. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a truce. But it was a start, a shared meal in the twilight, on $100 ranch at the edge of nowhere. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Jedediah would rise at dawn, his body aching from sleeping on the hard ground, and start his work. Ellie would be nowhere in sight, but he would often feel her presence, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, the feeling of being watched from the shadowy maw of the barn or the dense stand of cottonwoods by the creek. He started on the cabin roof, as he'd promised. It was brutal, back-breaking work for one man. He had to tear off the old rotten shingles, assess the damage to the beams beneath, and then begin the painstaking process of repair. He found a small stand of lodgepole pines on the far edge of his property and spent 2 days felling them and trimming them into usable planks with a handsaw, his palms quickly blistering and then callousing over. He would leave a plate of food on the stump every evening. Sometimes it was bacon and beans, sometimes flapjacks he'd managed not to burn. Every morning the plate would be gone, wiped clean. It was their only form of communication. He provided, she accepted. No words were exchanged. One afternoon, while he was perched precariously on the roof, trying to nail a new plank into place, his hammer slipped from his sweaty grasp. It clattered down the shingles and fell to the ground below. He let out a string of curses, his frustration boiling over. He was tired, sore, and keenly aware of how out of his depth he was. He started the long, careful climb down. But when he reached the bottom, the hammer was gone. He looked around confused, his irritation rising. Had it bounced somewhere unseen? Then he saw it. It was sitting on the porch steps, right where he would have to pass. He looked toward the barn. The doorway was empty, but he knew she had been there. She had seen him drop it, had retrieved it, and left it for him. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but it was the first crack in the wall of her silence. He picked up the hammer, a strange feeling in his chest. "Thank you," he called out to the empty doorway. He received no reply, but he hadn't expected one. The next day, a new offering appeared beside his morning plate of food, a small pile of wild berries, glistening like tiny jewels in the morning sun. They were tart and sweet, a welcome change from his monotonous diet. He ate them gratefully, a silent acknowledgement of her gesture. The dynamic between them was slowly shifting. She was no longer just a ghost haunting the edges of his property. She was a presence, a silent partner in his struggle. He started talking to her, or at least to the space she occupied. As he worked on the roof, he'd call out his plans, his frustrations, his small victories. "Well, Ellie, this beam is rottener than a politician's promise," he'd say, wrestling a piece of wood into place. "Or, if I can just get this section patched before the next rain, I might just sleep in a dry bed for the first time in a week." He never knew if she was listening, but it helped to break the profound loneliness of the work. It made the ranch feel less like his burden and more like theirs. One evening, as a storm was brewing in the west, the sky turning a bruised purple, Jedediah was working frantically to secure a large piece of oilcloth over the biggest hole in the roof. The wind was picking up, whipping his coat around him and threatening to tear the cloth from his hands. He was losing the battle, Suddenly, a second pair of hands appeared beside his. They were small and calloused, but surprisingly strong. Ellie had climbed the ladder without a sound and was now on the roof with him, her tangled hair whipping across her face as she grabbed a corner of the oilcloth and held it fast against the wind. Jedediah stared at her, stunned. It was the closest she had ever been to him. He could see the fierce concentration in her stormy eyes, the set of her jaw. She didn't look at him. She just focused on the task. Together they wrestled the oilcloth into place. He hammered in the nails with frantic energy while she held it down, her slight frame braced against the gale. The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as he pounded in the last nail. They scrambled down the ladder, soaked and breathless, and took shelter on the covered part of the porch just as the heavens opened up. The rain came down in a solid, deafening sheet, turning the dusty yard into a sea of mud. They stood side by side, not touching, watching the storm. The air was electric, charged with ozone in their shared effort. "Thank you," Jedediah said, his voice rough. She finally looked at him. In the dim light of the storm, her eyes seemed less wary, more open. "You would have lost it," she said. It was the first full sentence she had spoken to him since that first day. "I know," he admitted. "I'm not much of a roofer." A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Number. You're not." The smile transformed her face. It softened the sharp angles and lit a spark in her eyes. Jedediah felt his breath catch in his throat. For the first time he saw not just the wild, feral girl, but the beautiful young woman she was. "But you're learning," she added quietly, before turning her gaze back to the rain. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, listening to the drumming of the rain on the roof. The part of the roof that was now, thanks to both of them, holding fast against the storm. The wall between them hadn't just been cracked, it had been breached. And as the storm raged around them, Jedediah felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not just hope, but the promise of a shared future. Right here, in this broken-down home they were slowly, painstakingly building together. The storm broke the tension, and the patched roof held. In the clean-washed world of the following morning, something had irrevocably changed. Ellie no longer vanished at dawn. She was simply there. She moved with a quiet efficiency that Jedediah found mesmerizing. While he focused on the heavy, clumsy work of rebuilding, she took over the subtle, essential tasks of survival. She showed him where to find the best patches of wild onions and hardy greens by the creek. She taught him how to set snares for rabbits, her movements quick and precise, her explanations sparse but clear. "Here," she'd say, pointing to a barely visible trail in the grass, "they run this way at dusk." And they did. Soon their meals were more than just bacon and beans. They were stews, rich with meat and vegetables, cooked in the big iron pot over the fire. One day Jedediah turned his attention to the well. As Ellie had warned, the pump was seized with rust. He spent a whole morning wrestling with it, oiling it, tapping it with a hammer, all to no avail. Finally, he gave up in frustration and began the laborious process of hauling water up with a bucket and rope. Ellie watched him for a while, her arms crossed, a familiar, critical look on her face. Then, without a word, she disappeared into the barn. She returned a few minutes later, carrying a collection of odd-looking tools he'd never seen before. Long, thin metal rods and a wrench with a strangely shaped head. They were old man Miller's, she explained. He'd been a tinkerer. She knelt beside the pump and went to work. Jedediah watched, fascinated, as her nimble fingers probed the pump's inner workings. She seemed to understand its mechanics instinctively. She tapped here, twisted there, her brow furrowed in concentration. After nearly an hour of patient, focused effort, she motioned for him to try the handle. He pushed down, and this time, instead of a solid, unmoving resistance, there was a groan, a shudder, and then a miraculous give. He pumped it a few more times, and with a gurgling cough, a stream of water, clear and cold, gushed from the spout. Jedediah let out a whoop of pure joy. He splashed the water on his face, laughing. It was a victory, a huge one. He turned to Ellie, ready to shower her with praise, but she was already walking away, a faint blush on her dirt-smudged cheeks. She wasn't comfortable with praise, he was learning. She was comfortable with results. With the roof mostly patched and the well working, the cabin began to feel less like a ruin and more like a home. Jedediah moved his bedroll inside, and after a few days of hesitation, Ellie began to sleep there too, claiming the narrow cot on the far side of the room. They lived in the same space, but with a respectful distance between them, a silent acknowledgement of their strange circumstances. He discovered she couldn't read. Not really. She could recognize a few simple words, but sentences were a mystery to her. The discovery happened by accident. He was reading a tattered copy of a newspaper he'd brought from town, and she asked him what it said about the weather. He realized she wasn't just making conversation. She genuinely didn't know. That evening, by the light of a tallow candle, he pulled out an old primer he'd found in the bottom of a trunk. "Let's start with the basics," he said gently. She was resistant at first, her pride a fierce shield. "Don't need it," she mumbled, staring at the floor. "Everyone needs to read, Ellie," he insisted softly. "It's a tool, just like that wrench you used on the pump. It opens things up." She finally reluctantly agreed. Her progress was slow and halting, but she was fiercely determined. He would watch her, her brow furrowed in concentration, her finger tracing the letters as she sounded out a word. And when she finally read her first full sentence aloud, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog." The look of pure, unadulterated triumph on her face made Jedediah's heart swell. In return, she taught him things he could never learn from a book. She taught him how to read the sky, to know when a storm was coming not by a newspaper report, but by the color of the clouds and the behavior of the birds. She taught him the names of the constellations. She called her night friends. She showed him how to track, how to move silently through the woods, how to understand the subtle language of the wilderness. They were two halves of a whole, filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge. He was the builder, the planner, the one who knew of the world beyond the mountains. She was the survivor, the expert of their small kingdom, the one who knew its every secret. Their quiet life was interrupted by the arrival of Silas Blackwood. He rode up one morning, unannounced, a large, imposing man on a magnificent black horse that mirrored its owner's arrogant bearing. Two hard-faced men flanked him, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips. Blackwood surveyed the patched roof and the signs of life around the cabin with a sneer. His cold, dark eyes swept over Jedediah before settling on Ellie, a flicker of unpleasant recognition in them. "Well, well," Blackwood drawled, his voice a low rumble. "Look what the cat dragged in. A city boy and Miller's little stray. Playing house, are we?" Jedediah stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Ellie. "I'm Jedediah Stone, the new owner." "Owner?" Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're a squatter with a worthless piece of paper. This land, and the water that runs through it, should have been mine years ago." "The sale was legal," Jedediah said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "The deed is filed with the sheriff." "The sheriff?" Blackwood scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Jedediah's boot. "Brody's a toothless old dog. He can't protect you out here." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This is hard country, Mr. Stone. It has a way of breaking things. Fences, tools, people. It'd be a shame if you were to find yourself broken. A man could get hurt trying to tame a place that doesn't want to be tamed." His eyes flickered to Ellie again. "As for you, girl, I thought you'd have had the sense to run off by now. There's no place for you here anymore." Ellie, who had been silent, stepped out from behind Jedediah. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a cold fire. "This is my home, Silas Blackwood. It was my home when the Millers were here, and it's my home now. You're the one who's trespassing." Blackwood's face darkened with rage. He looked from her defiant face to Jedediah's steady one. He saw not two separate, vulnerable people, but a united front. "We'll see about that," he snarled. He wheeled his horse around so sharply that it kicked up a spray of dirt. "We'll just see how long you last." They watched him and his men ride away, a cloud of dust marking their angry departure. The beautiful, peaceful morning was shattered. The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Jedediah turned to Ellie. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. "He's a bad man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He tried to cheat old man Miller out of this land. He tried to dam the creek once. We won't let him scare us off," Jedediah said, with more conviction than he felt. He looked around at their small, patched-up world, the cabin, the barn, the clear running creek. It wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It was their sanctuary. It was home. He reached out and for the first time, took her hand. It was small and rough, but it fit perfectly in his. She didn't pull away. She just stood there, her fingers curling around his, and together they watched the dust settle on the horizon. The fight for the $100 ranch had just begun. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel for more Wild West stories, and please like and share our story.